want to welcome everybody to tonight's episode, and I'm very, very excited about this. We have with us tonight a Granite City, Illinois native, a longtime White House correspondent, an award-winning journalist, a former KSHE 95 disc jockey, and we're going to talk a little bit about those days, and one of our newest St. Louis Media Hall of Fame members. And Peter had the distinct honor or dishonor, I hope not, Peter, but being one of our first COVID class, the first Hall of Fame class that we had to do online. And actually, that's what kind of spawned some of this interview idea, taking 5 and just having these casual conversations so that we could get together and really highlight our St. Louis Media Hall of Famers. And I'm just thrilled to be able to talk tonight with Peter Maer. Peter, how are you?
Good to be with you, Ken. I'm just doing great.
Good, good. And you're where now? You're in Washington, D.C. or in Virginia?
I'm in the glorious Virginia suburbs of Washington, yes.
Excellent, excellent. Well, the whole premise of this, we're going to ask 5 questions, and there may be some other questions along the way, but just want to have a great casual conversation, catch up with you, kind of see what you're doing these days. But I want to just start with question number 1. And that is, and before I do any of this, Peter, I want to preface this entire conversation by saying, I want to know what people in Granite City, Illinois would want to know about these questions I'm going to give you. So share with me just how you got your start in broadcasting, and just start from the very beginning, because you were one of the very first classes at SIUE in the communications. I want to know about that. But I want to see how you went from being at KSHE 95, WIBV, to being on the White House press room.
Well, let's start from the very beginning. A very good place to start, as they said in some Broadway show way back when. I'm one of the unusual people who, I guess unusual, Ken, who always knew what he wanted to be. I was about 8 years old, and I said, I want to be a reporter. I like to tell people things they don't know. That doesn't mean that I was a gossip, or maybe I was, but I started on little grade school newspaper and Sunday school newspaper, and but I always wanted to be a newspaper reporter. Then I went to the Boy Scout Jamboree in I hate to tell you, 64, Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. And they gave me the opportunity to report home to Granite City, to the then Granite City Press Record, which sadly, like so many other local newspapers, is long gone, and to WGNU radio. And I had no experience with radio at that point. They gave me a tape recorder, and I had my notebook, and I had a typewriter that the Boy Scouts let all the troop reporters use. And I would send dispatches back to the Granite City Press Record, and I'd record things on little reels and send them back to WGNU in Granite City. I guess maybe a year or 2 after that, I got a call one day from WGNU, and they said, you know what? We're going to be starting a weekly Granite City High School news and record show, and we wondered if you'd want to do that. And I said, well, sure, I'll give it a shot. I didn't even have a driver's license at the time. My mom and dad used to have to drive me to the, to the radio station. And I think I had my FCC, I know I had my FCC transmitter license, operator's license, before I had my driver's license. But that's how it started. That's how the broadcasting started. And I decided then and there, even though I was the editor of the Granite High World newspaper, which thankfully is still in existence, I decided then I really like radio. I like the immediacy of it. And I guess the immediacy of it really got to me when President John F. Kennedy was killed. And the public park in Granite City, the beautiful Wilson Park, was near our house. And I went across the street and I saw my idol, the reporter for the Granite City Press Record. And then I also saw the guy from the radio station. Now, the Granite City paper came out twice a week. And I realized then that that guy was going to have to wait several days to get his story in. But the guy from the radio station was on the air live right there from the mobile unit, which was a station wagon with the letters WGNU painted on the side. So anyway, that's where I guess I got the radio bug, that and the Boy Scout experience.
Okay. So the radio, just seeing that first glimpse of a radio reporter being able to just tell that story instantaneously. Now, one of the things in your many awards that you've won over the years was the Walter Cronkite Award. What was it like watching Cronkite tell the story of JFK's assassination?
Well, I was home from school that day ill and watching TV when they interrupted with that news. So I did see all of Walter's famous coverage, and gee, what a thrill it was. He had already left the CBS anchor desk by the time I got to CBS, but I did have a chance to meet Walter and to work with him indirectly when he came back for some commemorative programming on radio.
Oh, sure. What was that like?
Well, it was just a delight. He was just such a wonderful guy, and of course, he loved radio. He started also, in radio. Well, he started as a print and wire reporter, but yes, he was just a really wonderful guy to be around. I'm not going to say that I worked with him closely, but just very indirectly. He was in New York and I was in DC.
Okay. Okay. Well, okay. So we've kind of got that the bug was planted and the seeds were there. The seed was planted. You started kind of nurturing it. What moved you to go to Southern Illinois University in Edwardsville?
Well, they had a really good beginnings at that time of a mass communications program, Ken. And I was in the very first graduating class
Yeah.
of mass communications majors at SIU Edwardsville, and I wear that proudly along with some of my fellow classmates. Terry Gainey, who worked for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch for a number of years, worked for the AP in Jeff City and was Jeff City bureau chief for the Post. Was another one of my classmates, and several other really wonderful people who went on to all kinds of jobs in advertising and broadcasting in St. Louis and other areas. So yeah, and it also gave me the opportunity to continue working in radio while I was going to SIU. For a while, I continued to work at WGNU, and then I was lucky enough, along with my pal Terry Gainey, to get work at WIBV in Belleville, which was just a marvelous training ground with a full-time news department, and got to cover the school board and the city council, county board of supervisors in St. Clair County, the police and fire beat, you name it, and even a smattering of sports for what was then called the Voice of Metro East, WIBV. So it was a terrific place to work. We had a great boss, Norman Greenberg, who was a great manager and still is a great communicator.
Tell me a little bit about Norm Greenberg, because you've referenced him a couple times when you talk about your career and your beginnings. What influence did Norm Greenberg have on you?
Well, patience, being fair-minded. Norm at the time did a show called Comment, where people would call in and talk to various people who were involved in politics and government and various other pursuits in Belleville and in the greater Metro East area. I later inherited that show myself, but Norm's patience with people like me, and I needed a lot of patience back then because I was, making some mistakes on the air now and then, and Norm was just a very patient and understanding guy, really good guy.
Good, good. Now, where'd you go after WIBV?
Well, I enjoyed my time at WIBV, and as you mentioned, I also at the same time they sort of the time sort of crossed together. Was working at KSHE in St. Louis, and KSHE was a beautiful music station when I started working there. That's what it used to be. And then all of a sudden, very gradually, under the leadership of Ron Ells, who of course is known as Johnny Rabbit and Johnny Be Good to generations in St. Louis. Ron was the program director, general manager of KSHE, and he eased that programming change from beautiful music to rock and then what was called underground rock at the
Underground.
time. Jimi Hendrix and Cream and oh my goodness, Moody Blues and
Yep.
all kinds of stuff. So that was an interesting place to work. I still spent much of my time in the transmitter room, which was where the AP wire machine was, because I was just such a newsaholic. And we did do a little bit of news on KSHE then,
Mhm.
nothing too sophisticated, no reporters, but we were rip and read. And I just loved to rip and read the news every hour. But anyway, getting back to the next stop from WIBV, I went to WLAC, 50,000 watt CBS affiliate in Nashville, Tennessee.
Okay.
And it was a news talk station and had a great time there, learned a lot. And from there to WSB Radio in Atlanta, the voice of the South, big.
This is your Atlanta Journal station, WSB in Atlanta, Georgia.
South, big time station. I never imagined that I'd ever work at WSB, because the signal of WSB was very much and is very much like the KMOX signal. You can hear it over much of the country. Of course, now you can hear any radio station anywhere because it's all online.
Right.
But I had great experiences there covering not the heart of the civil rights movement, not the Martin Luther King Day, but John Lewis. I met and became very, very fond of John Lewis, became a hero of mine, and Julian Bond, and a number of other people in the civil rights movement, and then people on the other side, people like Lester Maddox, who was a tyrant of a racist. He was the governor and lieutenant governor of Georgia back in that day. The governor, though, during much of the time that I was there, was Jimmy Carter.
Okay.
And Jimmy Carter became my ticket to Washington. I covered Jimmy Carter as governor, also covered the Georgia legislature. And Jimmy Carter was elected. And even before he was elected, I got a phone call from the Mutual Radio Network in Washington. And they said, we're looking for someone familiar with Jimmy Carter. And we understand you have always wanted to come to Washington. I made that known to a lot of people in Atlanta, including.
And if you think about that, at the time, the man from Plains, not a lot of people knew who he was nationally.
No, they did not. But at that point, he was the nominee, and he was running and running hard. I didn't cover that campaign, but again, Mutual called, and I went to Washington very quietly so that people in the Atlanta market didn't know about it, and auditioned for Mutual. And when Carter was elected, I think they called me the next day and said, "Would you like to come?" And we said, "Yeah, sure, absolutely." And moved to basically to Plains, Georgia, for the presidential transition, which would become the first of many transitions that I covered, Ken. And was there as Jimmy Carter chose his cabinet, and I was actually on the plane with him when he flew from Georgia to Washington for his inauguration.
Wow.
January 1977.
Oh, wow. So, and you covered presidents from Jimmy Carter through Barack Obama, correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay.
I didn't start full time on the White House beat until Ronald Reagan.
Okay.
I think the network, properly said, this guy's got to get a little more experience. You just don't move from Atlanta to covering the White House. I was in and out of the White House all through the Carter years, but they had me covering the Senate and the various departments. I covered the economic beat, the Commerce Department, the Labor Department for Mutual Broadcasting. And then again, when Ronald Reagan was in office, I moved over to the White House from the Senate beat.
Peter, roughly how old were you in this time frame?
I was in my late 20s.
Late 20s.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and suddenly you're there in Washington, D.C.
Yep, and learning a lot as I went along.
And how different is when you first got there with Jimmy Carter and then Ronald Reagan? What changes did you see during the course of covering Ronald Reagan to the time you were covering Barack Obama?
Well, let's start with technology.
Yeah.
When I was covering Jimmy Carter, I traveled with a typewriter, a Royal typewriter. that actually my grandparents gave me in Granite City. They gave me that for a high school graduation, and I dragged it with me all over the world, and starting when I was covering Jimmy Carter. We filed a lot of our reports on the radio, on the radio through the telephone lines. We would unscrew the mouthpiece of a telephone, and we had what were called alligator clips. And you would just plug these clips into the two terminals inside the mouthpiece and hook the other end into your tape recorder and file your tape and file your voice. So that was before satellites. The TV crews were shooting film back then and shipping their film. I remember being on whistle stop train tours or on the back of flatbed trucks on campaigns, and the TV people would be tossing their film to couriers to take back to some transmission point. And the still photographers would toss their film. Of course, now, if you're a still photographer, you're shooting on your camera and just filing it, online back to your editors. So just so many changes in technology, Ken, that I witnessed over the years. Eventually, I'm trying to remember, my first satellite broadcast was again with Mutual, and I think it must have been in 80 or 84 from a New Hampshire primary.
Okay.
And then during that campaign, a lot of times they would have me go to various radio stations wherever we'd stop overnight. So you'd be campaigning all day, and then at night, to file the reports for the next day, you have to go to some radio station that had a satellite uplink. So a lot of changes. And then, of course, no more typewriters. We went to laptops. And then by the time I finished my career at CBS News, we were filing our stuff on the web, special links online.
Wow. So you did see a few changes in all that.
Absolutely. And of course, the biggest change came with the advent of CNN, 24-hour news cycles. There were some other cable news outfits that came and went, but you had CNN and later MSNBC and Fox News. So that changed everything. And these days, all of my buddies who used to report for newspapers, and you'd have a morning or an afternoon deadline or evening deadline, now the deadlines just flow continually. If you're a newspaper reporter, you're filing just the same way the broadcasting people are.
So it really isn't rip and read anymore. It's rip and do.
Yeah.
Well, let's go to question number 2 now. And I want to preface this because in 2014, there was a Politico article that was right before the White House Correspondents' Dinner, where they surveyed 60 some different White House correspondents, and they asked you a number of different questions. And one of the questions they asked you was to finish the following statement: what most people don't know about covering the White House is. And I want to read this because I want to get this correct. You replied, "It's a very rewarding front row seat to history. The day that reporters covering the White House take the beat for granted is the day to find some other assignment or line of work." And then you go on, "I always describe it as the beat of last resort and first resort in terms of issues that end up in White House correspondents' inboxes. There are a few issues that don't somehow lend themselves to White House coverage, but it is not the glamour beat that most people think it to be. It involves persistence, lots of homework, long hours, and lots of travel." Now, as someone who has had that front row of history, that front row seat to history, and even if you weren't in the front row at the press briefing, if that was always Helen Thomas, you at least were in there within the first few rows. Share with me some of the most memorable moments that you had over this career.
Oh my goodness. How many hours do we have?
We can go all night. And I can...
Well, of course, the various elections, Jimmy Carter's election, Jimmy Carter's defeat, the Iran hostage crisis, which of course was one of the big events that led to his downfall. The Reagan presidency, which of course was so different than the Carter presidency, and each presidency, Ken, of course, is different. And it was during the Reagan presidency that CNN came into being, and that redefined so much of deadline reporting and turned things into a 24-hour news cycle, which of course we had always had in radio. There was the day Ronald Reagan was shot, and what we didn't know for a while, and his recovery, and all of the other things that happened during the Reagan years. Ronald Reagan was an interesting guy to cover. He was a guy who loved radio because he came from radio. He had worked in radio in Iowa, and he had a certain affection for radio people. And I had the opportunity to at one time have a conversation with him about radio and what it meant to him. And he did a weekly radio speech, which was very important to him.
Yep.
It was very important to him to get on the air on time and to get off the air on time.
Did you ever talk Illinois with him? Did you ever talk about he was from Dixon, Illinois. Did you ever talk about the similarities of Granite City?
No, and never had the opportunity to talk to him about that. I was with him at his ranch in California when he did one of his radio speeches, and I was in the room for it because the radio producer wasn't able to make it because of a flight problem. They asked me to step in at the last moment, and he called me over and showed me his script and how he marked it with a number 3 lead pencil, as he said, and said, you got to get on and off right on time. And after he finished the speech, he looked over at me and he said, right on the nose. I got off right on time, didn't I? Yes, Mr. President, you got off on time. And even if he wouldn't have gotten off on time, I would have said, yes, Mr. President, you got off on time. And then, of course, the Bush presidency, George H.W. Bush, the first Iraq War, and the various challenges that he had. President Bush also liked radio, and President Bush also liked reporters. Look, he didn't love everything we reported on, but he was always understanding and knew the role of reporters. He, of course, was a one-term president. Bill Clinton came along after that. I covered the entire Bush campaign and was with him the night that he conceded in Texas, conceded defeat with all kinds of grace and patriotism. And then came the Clinton years and the controversy, the personal controversy that Bill Clinton became involved in, and that put all of journalism, especially broadcast journalism, to the test, because there were certain things that happened in that controversy that really strained our usual efforts in terms of vocabulary and the things that we described on the air. So I covered the Clinton impeachment trial, and then on to George W. Bush and Barack Obama. I was with Barack Obama in Springfield on this frigid day that he announced his candidacy at the old state capitol building. And at that time we thought, well, does this guy have a shot? It's hard to say, but he did, as we know. And I was with him in Grant Park the night that he declared victory. And that is really one of the most memorable times that I ever covered.
Well, you have had that front row seat then and all these different things. And talk about some of your international travel as well with the presidents.
Well, there are a lot of foreign travels that come to mind, the various U.S.-Soviet summits that Ronald Reagan had with Soviet leaders, most memorably with Mikhail Gorbachev, and the arms deals that they made, and the famous Reykjavik summit in Iceland, where they came so very close, and they didn't make it that time, but later on they would cut various deals. I was in the Oval Office with President Bush when the Berlin Wall came down. It was my turn, fortunately, to be the White House pool reporter.
Oh, wow.
For all of the radio networks. And President Bush was very restrained in what he said. And there were reporters in there, myself, Leslie Stahl from CBS TV, CBS News, and a couple of other reporters were just pushing him for that soundbite, for that quote that we wanted. And he just wouldn't give. And I was very frustrated. And I got back to my little booth in the basement of the White House. And on the way down, it occurred to me, he was not going to, as he later said, we're not going to dance on the wall, because it was a very tenuous time. And Mr. Bush was a foreign policy expert from being a UN ambassador and CIA director. And he knew that you didn't want to put the Soviets on edge at that particular time because it was very unpredictable. And later, many, many years later, I was visiting with him privately at his home in Kennebunkport, Maine, sadly, just a few months before he passed away. And I said to him, you know, sir, I was really angry the day that the Berlin Wall came down and you just didn't give us what we were looking. Why were you angry? And I said, well, we were looking for quotes. And he just kind of smiled and said, you know, well, you know, there were other things at play back then.
Now you had just you brought up Marlin Fitzwater earlier, who took over as press secretary, actually I think communications director first when Jim Brady was shot with Reagan, and then was also George Bush's press secretary as well. You've referenced a couple times Fitzwater and Mike McCurry, Mike McCurry, as kind of the gold standards of press secretaries. And particularly with Marlin Fitzwater, what was it about Fitzwater that impressed you so much?
Well, Marlin had been a reporter way back when in Kansas, and he also came up through the bureaucracy. When Jim Brady was shot, his deputy Larry Speaks became press secretary, and Marlin was playing a very prominent role. And Marlin became press secretary after Larry. And Marlin has the distinction of being the only press secretary, Ken, who served two presidents, Reagan and the first President Bush. But Marlin never lied. Never, you know, he might have had to shade the truth every so often. Every press secretary does, whether you're press secretary for a governor, a member of Congress, state legislator, whatever. It just comes with the territory. But Marlin was just a real straight shooter, and the same with Mike McCurry, who was press secretary during some very trying times with President Clinton, but again, was very truthful, knew where reporters were coming from. Look, they both became angry at reporters at times. And, you know, we're not there to be their friends. We're not there to be president's friends. We're there to serve the American people and report the truth. And there's no fake news when it comes to objective reporters who work for regular news organizations. I hate to say mainstream, because there are so many streams these days, but I just cringe when I hear anyone, especially a president of the United States, constantly harping about fake news or calling reporters of all things the enemies of the people. Reporters for regular news organizations, the top newspapers and broadcast networks, magazines, such as they are these days, are friends of the people.
Well, and go back to that too, because you mentioned the changes when Bill Clinton came about, which really kind of coincided roughly with when CNN and the 24/7 news cycle came about. How different did you find it covering a president when you may have had more time to develop a story or change, you know, look into other sources for information or maybe dig deeper into a story than when it just became a 24/7 rip and do type of situation? Was there any difference in that?
Not much difference for me, to be quite honest, or for any other radio reporters, because we were always on call 24 hours a day. I mean, that clock just keeps spinning. CBS does 2 newscasts an hour at the top of the hour and 31 after the hour, 24/7. So as I always said, it was a very hungry animal.
It had to keep being fed.
Absolutely.
Okay. Any other part of the global travel? You mentioned the Berlin Wall. I read one time that you actually got roughed up by a KGB officer.
Well, that's true, and I wasn't the only one. That was on Ronald Reagan's first trip to what he called the evil empire. They got to Moscow, and I was on the Air Force One pool flying from, where did we fly from? I believe it was from Helsinki. Yes.
Okay.
Flew from Helsinki to Moscow, and we got to Moscow, and Ronald Reagan took a brief rest, and he and Mrs. Reagan decided, I don't think it was too much on the spur of the moment. Nothing really is. Things are always relatively planned. they took a stroll through an artsy area of Moscow known as the Arbat. And the Arbat at the time was one of the few places where you could go and buy trinkets in that society where there weren't very many stores or anything along those lines, but they sold crafts and so forth. And they decided to take a walk there. Well, the Soviet police were not used to reporters with shotgun microphones, trying to capture everything the president said, and people scribbling in notebooks and so forth, and they just started shoving us around. And I found myself picked up by two of these goons and basically tossed over a chain stanchion on the side of the walkway there in the Arbat, and it ripped my trousers, and I got a little bit bruised, and some equipment got busted. It was quite an adventure.
Had anything like that ever happened before?
No, not in my experience. I'm sure that other reporters certainly, and there were certain times. I mean, I was caught in rioting in Athens, Greece, on a trip with the first President Bush. My first trip to London with President Reagan. There were anti-U.S. protesters there, and things got a little bit dicey. So you find yourself in these situations, and you don't want to become part of the story, but sometimes you kind of do.
Yeah.
The other big foreign assignment that was really a life-changing experience for me, and I always talk about it to groups, was the Mexico City earthquake in the 1980s.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I spoke Spanish. You have to speak a language every day, but I did minor in it at SIU Edwardsville, and I always loved Spanish. I started studying it all through my years in junior high and high school in Granite City, and still do have a love for the Spanish language. So I was sent to Mexico City again by my first network employer, Mutual Broadcasting, when they had this horrific earthquake. Found myself stationed for several days outside a children's hospital, been a multi-story hospital, and it pancaked to the ground. And you could hear the babies crying in the rubble. And there were stories of mothers who were trapped in the rubble with babies, and they were nursing their babies in the rubble. And I don't know how many bodies I saw pulled out of there. Never had witnessed death on that scale, and thank God have not since. Never covered a war, by the way. And it really, for a young reporter who had covered the police beat and had become sort of callous to certain aspects of life, it really brought home the fragility of life. And it has stayed with me all these years. And I'll tell you, for 6 weeks or so after I'd been there, I could be exaggerating the amount of time, but I could taste the smell of death in the roof of my mouth for a long time. It was the first time I had smelled that awful smell, that awful odor. And it really stayed with me to stand there and see priests and cardinals, archbishops coming and performing the last rites over just rubble, just concrete.
I can't even imagine. I can't even
quite
imagine.
an experience. Quite an experience.
I can't imagine that even within your education, how that could even be taught, that could be a possibility when you're out reporting history like you do.
No, that's something that you learn and you hopefully don't ever experience again. I did cover the trip to the tsunami region in Asia. The second President Bush sent his dad and President Clinton on that trip, and CBS assigned me to be the pool reporter for the networks on that trip. And there I was with those two guys I had covered, and by then they'd become very close friends with President Bush, George H.W. Bush, and Bill Clinton. And we flew all over to, I think, 7 different countries and we didn't see bodies, but we saw the scale of death. And, we landed in someplace, a remote area of Indonesia, and the part of the tarmac was just lined with coffins, empty coffins just stacked up waiting for bodies. So again, that was the second time that we saw the scale of death like that, and had a chance to talk on the flight, to both of them about what we saw, the enormity of death.
Well, again, I can't even imagine that. But let's move now, and we'll, believe it or not, question number 3. Uh, and thinking about this, what do you consider your work ethic? How did you go about, again, being that cub reporter, if you will, from Granite City to now traveling with presidents? How did you just work to improve your craft?
Well, I always said don't imitate people, but emulate them.
Hmm.
And I had my heroes through the years, and some of them were at KMOX. I think to
Yeah.
Bob Hardy, great broadcast journalist Bob Hardy at KMOX, who had also worked at WIBV long before I got there, but he had worked at the Belleville radio station and, in fact, lived on the east side.
Hmm.
So I'd listened to Bob. I listened to other people, watched various pioneer broadcasters on television. I remember the advent of television in St. Louis when there was just one station, KSD TV, Channel 5.
Hmm.
And so that was one thing. And watching and reading newspapers and learning the importance of objectivity and not taking sides. I used to love to brag that I'm an objective reporter, but then I read a quote by David Brinkley, the famous broadcast journalist, who said something to the effect, Ken, of there's no such thing as objectivity, just varying degrees of subjectivity. But try to be, very careful, try to be objective, not to take sides, not to brag, but I guess I am after I retired and I started to let some of my relatives know the way I felt about certain politicians. I had one of my first cousins said, all the years that I followed your career, I never knew where you stood on anything or any issue or anybody. And that made me feel good.
Yeah.
So anyway, that sort of thing, you just play it straight. That's the important thing. I asked a friend of mine who was covering Donald Trump after he moved to the White House, and I said, how in the world are you guys going to deal with this? This guy's calling you enemies of the people and fake news and questioning and making fun of people and picking on people in the briefing room like no president had ever done. And this guy who's a veteran broadcaster said to me, you know what? We're going to do the same way we always have. Just play it straight.
It's interesting if you think about it, Peter, that you have covered so many different presidents. You have longevity. They have a term.
Yeah, I used to, there'd be young people who would come into the press office and try to not literally push us around, but kids who were really feeling their oats. And I used to say, you're just part of the passing parade. We were here when you got here, and we're going to be here when you leave. And some of them, I just had to say that directly to them. These weren't people who were very high up, but they were, immature people. And, we'd get into it sometimes. You can't stand here, you can't be there, you're not going to have access to this. And of course, our job was to push for as much access for our readers, listeners, and viewers as we possibly could.
How did you keep current with news as you were, again, honing your craft? What did you do? What did you read? How did you study to be able to have those questions just like that for presidents?
Well, a lot of reading of newspapers, of the opinion pages of all the newspapers of various types, from the liberal to the conservative end, and just constantly reading briefing papers and whatever the administrations were churning out and whatever their critics from the out of party, Democrats or Republicans were saying too. I used to say, being a White House correspondent is sort of like being a firefighter. You're sitting around waiting for the bell to go off, but you're constantly exercising and keeping your mind sharp and working the phones, calling Capitol Hill and finding out, what's going on at that end, calling the various agencies, calling people who perhaps were out of office to get their opinions. So it just never stopped. It really didn't. And you said at the beginning, you were going to ask what you thought people in Granite City would want to know. And that was always my byword when I was working. If I'd go into a news conference or into a briefing, I would think, either directly in my mind, what did the people back in Granite, what did the people back in St. Louis or Alton or St. Charles, what do they want to know about this? What do the people from the heart of the country need to know, and what do they want to know about what we're about to cover? And keep in mind, most of the time, I only had 35, 40 seconds max to tell the story. Network radio is a headline service.
Headline service. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So reading everything, getting those connections, making those relationships happen. Was there ever a time where, you just heard something from somebody and you just had a hunch that either I needed to dig deeper, or boy, this is a story that's got to be told right now?
Oh, absolutely. There were a number of times, and I always like to tell young journalists, don't ever assume anything about any fact or anybody. Anytime I would assume something, it would be on the verge of getting me into trouble. But yeah, there were things that I heard. I mean, what would be an example? I mean, it's been a long time in its ancient history, but I heard that Donald Regan, who was then Ronald Reagan's chief of staff, was in trouble and that he was about to get the axe. Again, not something that people in Granite City would be sitting on the edge of their seat saying, oh my goodness, what's going to happen to Donald Regan? But, it's sort of in a way, an inside the Beltway story, but always a big deal when someone in the presidential inner circle gets canned.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to know where people stand and what team they're on. And I knew that Mrs. Reagan was not a big fan of Donald Regan, I'd heard that they had gotten into it. And I went to a young guy who was, one of her disciples, and said, is Regan on his way out? And he said, well, I'll let you know. And that let me know that something was boiling there.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't too long after that the guy called and said, be ready. He's about to be canned. And I said, can I quote you? And he said, not by name, but you can go with it on what we call background. In other words, quoting an administration official. And so that's just one example of the kind of thing you ask about.
Well, and here's something. I mean, you're still very involved in the SIUE community, and you've come back a number of times to speak and do different events and such. What advice do you share with either just young people coming into journalism, or just anybody within their careers or life? What are some of the things that now, as you look back retrospectively, that you're able to share with people?
Well, a couple of things. One of my teachers at SIU Edwardsville told us, and it's not original to him, but be nice to the people you meet on the way up because you might meet them on the way down. That's a humbling bit of advice. And also, I tell journalism students, in fact, I spoke to a master's candidate the other day, a young woman studying at NYU, and she said, what advice do you have? And I said, be flexible. You have to be flexible these days. I don't think that in this era, it would be a good idea to be at the SIU Mass Communication School and say, I'm going to be a radio journalist, because maybe you're not. But you have to learn all of the technology, everything that's out there. You have to learn to write quickly and write accurately. You have to learn how to master, everything there is about online reporting and production too.
What other types of advice do you give? And it sounds like you do speak a lot of times to classes and journalism classes. What other pieces of advice would you give?
Well, another piece of advice that I really like to give is to find yourself a good internship. It's not as easy as it used to be, because there are certain rules about unpaid internships, paid internships, and so forth. But if you can get your foot in the door as an intern or as a desk assistant at one of the TV stations in St. Louis or anywhere, any other market, that's a good way to go. I can't begin to tell you how many people started as desk assistants and moved all the way up to, well, the current president of CBS News, a woman I very much admire, Susan Zirinsky, started as a desk assistant in the Washington bureau of CBS News. And she basically hasn't worked anywhere else and has just gone up, up, up. And now she is, as I say, the president of CBS News. And previous president of CBS News started as a desk assistant in radio.
Hmm.
And a number of the DAs or desk assistants who I met in network radio went on to become producers at 60 Minutes and the CBS Evening News, and the same thing at other networks. So you just have to get your foot in the door and be ready to start very small. Don't think that you're going to be sitting in the anchor chair at Channel 4 or Channel 5 in St. Louis, or you're going to become, the next Nora O'Donnell in 2 years. You got to pay your dues.
Well, one of the things I've read that you've said repeatedly is persistence. Be persistent. What value does persistence give a White House reporter?
Well, it tells the sources that you're working with, and perhaps your bosses and the editors who are assigning you, that you're playing for keeps, that you're serious about this, and that you're not going to give up. And it also reminds them that, well, when that story does break, Ken's been pretty persistent. Let's give him a call. Um, I had a boss who had been a press secretary. And when I went to the White House beat, I said to this guy who had been a veteran press secretary in Washington, what advice do you have for me as I become full-time White House correspondent? And he said, I've got to clean this up a bit, make yourself the biggest pain in the rear that you possibly can. It's the only way they're going to take you seriously. It wasn't really in me to be a pain in the rear,
Yep.
but I guess the persistence really is what it comes down to. You can still, slice that with a bit of nicety too.
Yeah. And thinking about nicety, and think about Midwestern nicety, and you've always used your Granite City as that grounding point. How has that grounded you over the years?
Well, I never forgot where I came from. I mean, it was just such a great place to grow up, and a place that gave me many opportunities, as I said, at the little local radio station, little 500-watt radio station at the time, where people taught me and were patient with me. And it was a colorful place to work, a radio station that was located in 3 mobile homes that were hooked up together. The first one had the lobby and the transmitter and the studio, and the second one had what passed for a newsroom, and the third one was the trailer that was the executive suite of the owner, Charles Chuck Norman, who was a colorful St. Louis guy. But just each and every one of those opportunities, and the high school was a great place to learn, just incredible teachers and very wonderful parents, of course, which we all go back to. My dad was an optometrist in Granite City, and my mom was the all-around PTA president and den mother and room mother and so forth. So a real firm, more than anything else that I could point to at any radio station or network, my mom and dad.
Yeah, no, that's great. And just thinking about your mom, when you think about your parents, and again, I know your father passed away a number of years ago, but your mom is still with us and still following your career. What do you think your mom is most proud of that her son has done?
Well, my mom has 3 sons, and so she's equally proud of all of us. That's for sure. But she lived vicariously through all of these different opportunities, and brought her to Washington several times. She met President Reagan and President Clinton, came to some White House Christmas parties with me. So, she got to experience a lot of it. And mom and dad, I mean, when I was an evening country DJ on WGNU FM, they were just glued to the radio, and they always were. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, Peter, this has been fantastic getting a chance to catch up with you and hear a little bit about some of your background, your history. I just want to wrap it up. Just bring us up to speed with what you're doing now. I mean, now that you've been retired for a few years, what are you doing now? What's keeping you busy?
Well, I'm enjoying retirement. I do a certain amount of volunteer stuff. I'm on the board of directors of the National Interfaith Alliance, which I really believe in their mission of fostering interfaith relations. And I love talking to journalism students, whether they call for advice or I get the opportunity to speak to them. Next month, as we speak next month, in January of 2021, I'm going to be doing an online program about media literacy and about disinformation and misinformation with a very talented young woman who's an expert on those things. I'll be moderating a discussion with her. So these things come along, and I really enjoy all of these opportunities in retirement, but I don't miss the White House grind at all.
Well, if you want, can you share a little bit about your own family situation? Do you have children? What are they doing, if you're comfortable with that?
Sure, I've got two grown children. My wife and I, my wife of 48 years and I.
Oh, wow, congrats.
There's a special place for the spouses of people in the news business, Ken. They are very patient and understanding people. So we have two grown children. One of them is a middle school counselor, and the other one is an executive for a major airline. And we have 5 grandchildren.
Oh,
so
great.
Those are each one a blessing, and also my other occupation, if you will, is keeping up with all of them and watching them grow up, which is just a real delight.
Oh, well, that's fantastic. And I hope you're able to get together with them, and if not in person, at least through Zoom and through some of the technology.
Well, as we record this, and I don't know how long it's going to be, well, anything you record is out there forever, but we're in the midst of this terrible pandemic. Yep. So all in all, most of what we see is by Zoom or FaceTime, and thank goodness for that.
Yeah. Well, again, I want to thank you for taking the time out tonight to talk with us and just to kind of catch up and just let us know what you're doing. Thank you so much. We are just thrilled that you're now part of the St. Louis Media History Foundation Hall of Fame, and a well-deserved honor. And I wish we could have all been together this year to welcome you in, but one of these days. Yeah,
I'll look forward to that. It was just such an honor to be recognized with all of the other people who had just such glorious careers, better than mine, I might say, in many respects. But it was great to be honored with them. I'm really sorry we couldn't do it in person, and I hope we can. But that honor and a previous honor with the St. Louis Press Club, a lifetime achievement with the Press Club, were just two really special things that happened to me over the course of the past year. So thank you very much for that honor again.
Well, thank you. And thanks for joining us tonight. And we look forward to talking to a lot of you soon. And if there's anything we can ever be doing, or if there's some particular Hall of Famers that you're interested in hearing from, please let us know. Thank you very much. Have a great night.
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Mr. President, if I may return to Russia for a moment. As your spokespersons have told us over the past few days, there are other reformers there. Is there a danger in putting too much American weight behind Boris Yeltsin?
I don't think so. This is I know that there's some people say, well, what's the difference in this and the Gorbachev situation before, and is this the same sort of problem? I tried to answer that question earlier about what the United States interests are and how we would pursue them. And I've tried to be supportive of reformers throughout Russia, and indeed throughout all the former communist countries and the former republics of the Soviet Union. But he is, after all, the first elected president in 1,000 years. He has the mandate of having been voted on in a free and open election where people were free to vote and free to stay home, something that was not true previously. And that is something you would expect me to do. Let's put it in a different context. Suppose, well, we just had the Prime Minister of Great Britain here, right? And the United States and Great Britain have had historic ties and shared values. You expect me to work with the Prime Minister of Great Britain, even if he is of a party that was openly supportive of my opponent in the last election. I mean, you know, this is not a, Boris Yeltsin is the elected president of Russia, and he has shown a great deal of courage in sticking up for democracy and civil liberties and market reforms, and I'm going to support that. Yes,
important thing to do.
One housekeeping question. As Mike mentioned, you made this trip announcement on Twitter this morning. It still hasn't shown up on any of our usual vehicles through your office officially. Is Twitter now going to become your vehicle of choice to tell us
Part of the
major things?
reason I did that, I bet some of you got emails that I sent you several hours after I actually sent them to you, because there were some email issues here at the White House, and we felt like it was important to get a confirmation of that out. I would say Twitter is a quick medium to get information out, and we'll probably use it more often.
You know, there are about 20 or 25 other Robert Gibbses on Twitter, some of them who deign to use your picture, I don't know why, or the presidential seal or the podium. Are you concerned that, you know, one of these guys is going to hijack your message and, you know, maybe burn you at some point?
No. I will say this. I mean, again, I think if you go to, I don't know how many Robert Gibbs there are,